and welcome to Coffee with Coach. Every pastor wants to be known as a great preacher, yet the common conception of preachers is that they are boring, out of touch, and hugely irrelevant. How can you overcome that stereotype? There are ways to become a better preacher. Today I want to focus on illustrations. How do you find great illustrations? How do you choose which ones to use? And how do you incorporate them into your message? Stick around. I'll give you a whole lot to think about. Illustrations. I'm Steve Petty, and I have 3 goals for these videos: to help you become a better pastor and leader, to save you time and money, and to help educate, motivate, and energize you so you can motivate and energize your church. If you find these videos helpful, I hope you will subscribe to my channel, and if you have questions or comments, you can add them below or email me at steve@revstevep.com. There's a really old joke about a prisoner who gets locked away for a long, long time. On his very first night in prison, he's really kind of afraid. Late at night, when the lights go out, there's this total silence. And all of a sudden, he hears a voice. Somebody yells out, "Hey, how about 23? There's this mild chuckle rumbles through the cell block. A little while later, somebody yells out, "Hey, 47! The place erupts in laughter. Everybody's yelling, having a good old time. A little while later, somebody says, 52. The place just explodes again. New prisoner doesn't know what's going on. Goes up to the corner and he psst, 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 calls to the prisoner next to him. Guy comes and says, "What do you want?" He said, "What are they doing? What are these numbers?" The guy says, "Well," says, "we've been here so long, we all told all the jokes we know. So finally we just numbered them, and now all we do is yell out the numbers." "Oh, so these are jokes?" I says, "Yeah." He said, "They're great jokes. Man, they're just great." The guy says, "Well, can I try it?" The old guy goes, "Well, you can try." He thinks about it for a little while and he says, 18. The place is deathly silent. Nobody says a word. Old guy in the cell next to him goes, "Yeah, some people just can't tell a joke." I used to start every sermon I'd preach with a joke. There were several reasons for it. One, people got used to the joke. They would become awake at the beginning of the sermon because they wanted to hear the joke. Second, it makes them laugh, which expels air out of the lungs, gets their lungs involved. They get a little bit of fresh oxygen, so at the beginning of the sermon, they're a little bit more ready to hear. And it connects them with the idea I'm going to be talking about in the sermon. I can take that joke and meld it right into the beginning point of the sermon and have their total involvement. So people were always ready to hear the rest of what I was going to have to say. It's just a stupid joke. But it was a useful tool for rhetoric. So, how do you use illustrations? How do you keep people involved? I know a lot of preachers these days don't use illustrations at all. They think illustrations are hackneyed, they're old-fashioned. A lot of people have gone to video clips. Well, video clips are great. But illustrations involve the brain in a different way. Go all the way back to Marshall McLuhan. The media is the message. Video clips, they're color, they're bright, they're animated, they're moving, they're pictures, they're talking. It actually involves less of the brain because it's involving more of the brain. In other words, once you give the visual clues, the colors, the background, the story, the dialogue, and give it the whole thing, you're actually less involved than if just somebody tells you the story. Then your brain has to manufacture the people's faces, the way they're talking, the background, the colors. Your brain has to take all of that minimal information and fill in all of the places. So the brain is actually more activated when you're using a simple illustration of telling a story. So how do you tell a story? Well, first of all, you look for a story that matches whatever it is that your theme is saying. The first thing I want to do when I use a story is to think about my congregation. Which particular congregation am I preaching to? Now that I'm a visiting preacher and I go around to different churches, I need to know that. Is this predominantly a younger congregation? Are they a new congregation? Is this an older congregation? Is the congregation predominantly 75 and older? Is the congregation predominantly younger families with children? Is the congregation empty nesters? Why? Because each group has a different background. There are stories in their lives that resonate with them. If I'm going to talk to a retirement home, I'm probably not going to talk to them about TikTok videos. If I'm talking to a younger clientele, I'm in a younger congregation with young children, I'm probably not going to talk about the Nixon administration. There are things that you want to say to different groups. So, as a general rule, I tried to make sure that I had one illustration that spoke specifically to the generation I'm talking to. That's tough, but you can find one. The second kind of illustration I would try to have would occasionally be a personal illustration. If I tell my own story, like today's coffee cup. Okay, Savage Days, what's that about? Well, Savage Days is the mug that we would get when we worked in the Yellowstone National Park. All the park employees were called Savages, and I worked there in 1967. I drove a Sunbeam, so everybody called me Sunbeam Steve. But my badge at the gas station where I worked, the Conoco station, said Sunbeam Steve, the Jolly Green Giant, because we wore these big green togs that covered us from head to toe, and we were green. I was, in fact, the Jolly Green Giant. And I worked at Tower Junction in 1967. So this is a mug that's a historical piece for me. It's a great illustration, and it tells a little bit of my history. And I could tell you a story out of Yellowstone. Did I ever tell you the story about the elephant in Yellowstone? Oh, well, I'll save that for another day. But you get my point. You can tell a personal illustration. Just don't tell every illustration as a personal illustration. People think the only thing you can talk about is yourself. One, every sermon, even that might be a bit much. 1 or 2 a month. That's probably good. And then I would try to make sure that there was an illustration in terms of taking the biblical story and making it into an illustration. Repaint that picture. The prodigal son returns. What's going on? Retell that story in a slightly different way. Jesus arguing with the Canaanite woman. Tell that story. Tell it to them again. Fill in some of the illustration parts. Let them see the crumbs under the table. So make some illustrations that involve people's thinking, that allow you to make your point, but make it more than just you. Make it more than just you. You're talking to them about things that they know, illustrations from their generation, but you're talking to them personally with some of your own background, and you're talking to them maybe historically. I remember one summer, Lewis and Clark was being celebrated because it was an anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So I used several illustrations from the Lewis and Clark stories, things that they did, things that went on their trip. It was a current event in the newspapers, and I made it a current event in Sunday morning. You can do all kinds of things with illustrations. Make them come alive. Tell the story, which brings me to the last point. When you're telling an illustration, move out of your text. In other words, become so familiar with the story, you can just stand up and talk to them about the story. What I hate is when somebody has an illustration and they read it with the same boring monotone they just read the rest of their sermon. You don't even get the fact that it's a story. It's just another part of the boring monotone. They're not looking at you. They're looking down at their page. They're reading. When you're reading a sermon to people, you're really not trying to connect with them. You're trying to connect some thought with them, but you don't even really care. People want to know you care. You have to look at them. You have to look them in the eye and tell them a story. So become so familiar with the story that when you get to the illustration, you can put your manuscript down and you can tell them a story. Whether it's a joke, whether it's a historical illustration, whether it's a personal illustration, look them in the eye. Imagine you're sitting around the campfire in the summertime and you're going to tell them a story. Okay, don't put the flashlight under your chin, but tell them a story. Make sure you tell it like it's really important. And then they'll remember. I've had people come up to me years later and say, "Oh, I remember that sermon you preached when you talked about," and it's always an illustration. But the illustration connects them to the point. And I ask them, "Well, do you remember what the point was?" They can always remember the point. So illustrations help you make a point that connects with people that they can take home and carry with them for a long, long time. Use illustrations. You should almost always have an illustration for every point, except maybe the scripture. Scripture becomes its own illustration. But try to have an illustration for every point you're making, because that brings it home, makes it real, involves the congregation in more particular ways. Use illustrations. It makes you a better preacher. It makes your congregation better listeners. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed these thoughts about illustrations. Next week, I'm going to be talking about something that's hot on everybody's lips these days: clergy burnout. How to identify it, heal it, and burn brightly again. So, I hope you find these videos helpful, and I hope you'll subscribe to my channel. And if you have questions or comments, you can add them below, or you can email me at steve@revstevep.com. Until next week. Coffee in Yellowstone. Well, actually it was beer. See you next week on Coffee with Coach.